Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever our audience may be. I'm delighted to welcome everybody to a Kennan Institute Longview conversation. Before I introduce today's distinguished conversant and the book of our distinguished conversant, I'd just like to say thank you to the Kennan Institute, to Victoria Pardini and its staff for making this event possible, and also to inform our listeners and viewers that this is part of an ongoing Longview deep dive set of conversations about Russia and the post-Soviet space that attempts to get behind the headlines, to slow the conversation down, and to look with care at the core policy issues and other issues that are confronting us at the present moment. So I can think of no better speaker to guide us through this enterprise of trying to take a longer and a slower view of things than Dr. Jade McGlynn, who's joining us today from the United Kingdom and is a research fellow in the Department of War Studies at King's College London, and the author in recent months of not one but two really remarkable books about Russia, about Russian media, about Russian state ideology, and about some of the cultural drivers behind Putinism, and most importantly, I would say, behind his decision to invade Ukraine on the 24th of February, 2022. And I think Jade's scholarship, research, journalism, and public writings really helps us to understand why this invasion took place and helps us to understand some of the responses of the Russian population to this invasion. So I'll just mention the title of the book that we're going to look at in detail. It's not both books that we'll discuss, although they may come up in the course of the conversation, but the book that we're going to speak about today is titled Memory Makers, The Politics of the Past in Putin's Russia. So being myself in the professorial business, I would like to just outline the questions that I have for Jade, and then we'll speak for roughly 40 minutes, and we'll eagerly collect the questions of our audience in the Q&A function of Zoom. And the outline is going to be as follows. I'd like to ask Jade a few questions about state ideology in Russia, sort of what it is, what its core tenets are. Secondly, I'd like to ask about the media infrastructure, the apparatus that has been built up, not just over the last 2 years, but really over the last 21 years or rather 24 years that Putin has been in power. And then finally, I'd like to ask about how the 2022 war, has confirmed some of these trends and how it may have unsettled a few of these trends as well. So that's my three-part outline. Very, very happy to welcome Jade to the Longview, and I'll start in just with sort of a first question. Your book, Memory Makers, does trace three basic beliefs, but there are more, I'm sure, that sort of define the Putinist outlook at the present moment. So not assuming that our audience has read every page of your book, I'll begin there and just sort of ask you, Jade, if you could outline what this outlook is.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Michael, and thank you very much to the Kennan Institute for hosting. I have to say that recently I did an audiobook admittedly for a different book, and I'm pretty certain that I haven't read every page of my own books because some of the sentence structures, it's very painful. But yes, I mean, in terms of the broad overview of the book, sometimes I find it quite hard to distinguish it from my own research because, of course, it's a book that began in 2014 that was sparked simply just by watching an awful lot of Russian news, of Russian propaganda, and then becoming quite fascinated by the emotions and the responses that it triggered, I suppose, in people in my surroundings as I lived in Russia at that time. And I wanted to understand, in particular, the role of the past and the role of making analogies with the past, because it felt to me like it was something a bit more than historical propaganda. And of course, that's essentially what I argue in the book, is that, first of all, it's very reductive to think of this process of the World War II cult, of other sort of elements of militarism, the deification almost of the state as the emblem of the nation, as something that is a purely top-down process. It's also in response to something, because you used the word ideology. And of course, that's a word that triggers a lot of debate, because certainly, and I would agree with this, most people would argue that Putin, when he came into power, there's many years ago, was not ideological. And I think that's true, but there's a process that sort of evolved, or at least in the regime, because once you start talking about an individual, it always becomes slightly difficult to ascertain their views. But if we talk about the regime, the ideas it's putting into practice, we see very much this focus on the idea that Russia needs a strong state and that the people are for the state, not the other way around. We see the idea that Russia is an innately great power, and we see the idea that Russia has a sort of a special path, but also has a mission in the world. It has a particular role, something that can add. And what I tried to trace in Memory Makers is the role that history and memory play in this, in particular in this special role. And that's through the idea of the way that the Kremlin uses historical propaganda, not simply on that, I suppose, quite superficial level to play on people's emotions. Every country does that. But it also uses it to tell a story about how the Russian people supposedly have a superior sense, a superior access to historical truth. And it's their job to then, and particularly the state's job, to both defend historical truth as they see it, but also to help other countries defend their own historical truth, their own sovereignty, their cultural sovereignty from the cultural colonization of, well, bluntly, the US and its friends, if we go by the national security strategy of 2021 or the foreign policy concept in its most recent iteration of 2023. And I think just as I sort of wrap up this answer, I do want to draw attention to the relevance of doctrine and strategy, because these elements, they are written out. And I think that's something that sometimes in some Western policymakers' minds doesn't always play a role. And I think so often of the fact that you have 38 references to culture in the Russian national security strategy, and in the American equivalent, you have one, and it's to agriculture. And I think it shows a real chasm, a real difference in the way that the two countries, and I would say the UK has a very similar conception to the US in this sense, the way that the two countries conceptualize security and culture and the intersections between them.
Wonderful. I mean, it's a good occasion to say how rich the book is on all of those topics, and I very much appreciate your point about what's written out. Despite being, the sort of famed enigma wrapped in mystery, wrapped in things that are impossible to figure out, the Russian government does, in some ways, quite transparently signal what its intentions are and what its beliefs are, and I fully agree that that sometimes gets missed. Before moving on to the kind of infrastructure of this, the technique of disseminating historical memory and exploiting historical memory, I wanted to just, lingering on the subject of content, to ask you about this notion. It sort of appears throughout the book of a renaissance in Russia, a kind of rebirth of Russianness. And it's not a simple matter for reasons that you articulate in the book. Maybe it could be a two-part question. That which is Russian, ethnically Russian, sort of linguistically Russian, Russian Orthodox perhaps, is embedded in today's Russia in many other identities and affiliations. So in that sense, it's sort of complicated to say what this Russian Renaissance is. But I'm also curious about the nature of the Renaissance itself. And you mentioned the United States. This sort of, to me, conjures the 1990s and a period where Russians could think of themselves as perhaps imitating Western models. And, you might also factor in the kind of humiliation of quote unquote losing the Cold War. Is that the relevant context for this Renaissance, or is there a sort of broader continuum? This is the kind of thing that the Russian state has sort of always done to generate some kind of loyalty through culture and memory, and in that sense, it's maybe a bit less unique. So a two-part question: the kind of Renaissance of Russianness. What is Russianness within this Renaissance, and what's the sort of view of the last 20, 30 years?
Mm-hmm. So the Russianness question is one that I always that I think about a lot, but also I'm singularly not particularly well placed to answer, right? Because I'm a Russia specialist, so obviously I'm going to see it as something Russian, but these things happen. So I think that my own position on this is I think there is something specific about Russia's, or specifically intense about Russia's uses of history. If we think back to James Billington's wonderful work, The Icon and the Axe, and he writes about the peculiar use of history, the way that, you know, throughout the Romanov period, there's a particular use. And I think we could even go back to the enthronement of, for example, Ivan the Terrible, and the use, the rebranding of many what were essentially traits left over from the period of the Mongol invasion and the Mongol occupation, and rebranding them as Kievan Rus, for example, as elements that went back to Kievan Rus. But to a certain extent, of course, all countries do that. And I think if I think about, I mean, certainly in the UK, I can think of many examples, and I wouldn't dare to have an opinion on the US, but perhaps you can think of some. But I also think that in terms of this idea of the Renaissance, and in terms of the way that it's said, almost this rebirth, this cult for rebirth, the way that it's discussed by, let's say, some of the more prominent ideologues, the more prominent thinkers, if that's not too overblown a term to describe people like Vladimir Medinsky, is very much in a language that I think we would find in other countries. I think it's the language of illiberalism, and illiberalism in Marlène Laruelle's sense of a post-liberalism, that these are countries that either have experienced or believe that they have experienced a form of sort of liberal democracy, and feel bitter, feel angry about some of the elements there, you know, the constant referencing to a certain idea of a liberal elite that's both, you know, completely impossible to uproot, but is also doesn't belong anywhere. It's deracinated and impossible to uproot. The notion, the nostalgia, the idea that there is this essence that was lost and that it can somehow be regained. Of course, there's an element of that that's just reactionary, but I think it's part of a more global trend. And certainly when we look at who Russia tries to appeal to in terms of, I guess, what we might call its memory outreach, its efforts, as per its foreign policy concept, to push not just Russian history narratives, but also the notion that essentially the liberal theory of memory, which we might say is the notion that if we all kind of face up to all of the terrible things we did, we can overcome that, and then we can become better countries. I guess the German example being the most obvious one. That actually that's the wrong path, and the better path is essentially to look at what makes you proud, to look at those moments in your history, to feel proud of your history, and to embrace those elements, and to not really acknowledge the crimes that have been done. And I think it can be understood as a backlash, in the same way that illiberalism is a backlash against, let's say, some of the economic elements of globalization, of liberalism, I suppose, depending on one's political position, perhaps slightly run amok. Then I think we can see Russia's more globalized version of memory politics as part of a broader reaction, of course, always in its national context, but against that liberal memory paradigm that everybody has to face up to all of the bad things that they did. And I think we see elements of that in every single country. I certainly wouldn't have to search too hard to find some people who would argue, but what about the railways, if I brought up about the British Empire? So.
Well, since you asked, I mean, there are two presidents who have championed the phrase "Make America Great Again." One is of course familiar, Donald Trump, but the other was Ronald Reagan, who used the phrase in his speeches, and the phrase from his 1984 campaign was "Morning in America." So it's not to suggest equivalence; these are very different figures from Putin, exactly as you say, in different contexts. But that impulse to reconstitute, to sort of regather, you know, reconstruct, is certainly something that that crosses borders. So if we could move now to the second topic of conversation, and this is the technique and methods through which this view of history is propagated, one of Russian greatness, one where there's a certain special role to be played in the world, where Russia has returned to a position of pride after a period of denigration, and certainly that has lots of patterns in previous epochs of Russian history, and we'll relate all of this to the war in the third part of our conversation. But in a sense, how does Russia put the argument forward here? I think, although it's useful to compare Russia to Germany or to the UK or to the US, there are definitely echoes. It does seem to me that Russia is very, very different in this regard. So one point that came through in your book was the importance of television. I don't think in the US television matters all that much for politics in general, but for historical memory, I think television is probably really a very remote channel for something like that. I can't speak for the UK or Western Europe, but I suspect that it's basically similar. But in the Russian case, I think there's really a much more tightly connected bond between the Kremlin on the one hand and the memory making media are not just television. They could be movies, and you concentrate on various institutes and sort of book publishing and all of that. But let's begin there. So we have a sense of the cultural claims that are being made. How are they sort of embedded, instantiated in the Russian population?
I think that's a really important question, though I would very, very lightly maybe suggest that perhaps film or television, if we think about television series or films, I have to apologize for the children running amok. There is somebody looking after them. They are fine and safe. But I think if we think about films and sort of television series, I mean, they probably do have quite a notable impact, certainly in the UK, on people's understanding of actually what happened in World War II, probably a much bigger understanding than any history textbook has. So that's one, I suppose, just one very, very slight pushback. But in terms of how it's done, of course, there's elements of this happening from the start. You can go back to Putin's speeches of 2000, you go back to his sort of the turn of the millennium speech and find all of these references to the need to sort of respect history because our future depends on it, et cetera, et cetera. But really it's 2012, which is declared the year of the history, when you start to see a lot of plans, some of which were begun earlier, but never really developed properly. You start to see them all come together. And in particular, the role of these sort of government organized NGOs like the Russian Military Historical Society, which has people like Sergei Shoigu, obviously the Minister of Defense, Dmitry Peskov on its advisory board, and is headed by the former culture minister and now President Jade on matters of memory, who is widely rumored to have written Putin's infamous on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians essay in 2021, which is essentially the ideological, I suppose, justifications for the war, at least, maybe not all of them, but at least a good chunk of them. And then the other important society would be the Russian Historical Society, which is headed by Sonia Narishkin, who is obviously the head of foreign intelligence, which again, I think brings us back to that intersection between security and identity memory that is something that's missed out sometimes. In terms of so they played a very important role in shaping popular culture and shaping academic culture. I focus more on popular culture because I'm more interested, I suppose, in mass society. But they, of course, played in terms of the production of films about World War II, et cetera, et cetera. And it's very interesting. If you watch these films, you will find that Ukrainians are essentially either bluntly stupid sidekicks, who are kind of funny and maybe just have a soft h rather than a g sound to Russians, and those Ukrainians are good, or they're traitors. And you really have these two roles. And I think it's sometimes perhaps been overlooked the extent to which, popular culture, of course, plays such an important role in forming people's conceptions of the world, especially I think in a country like Russia that has so much propaganda, and where propaganda has such a complex relationship with political apathy, with cynicism, with the notion of who can know the truth, and then individuals sort of form their own truths, their own sense of who is good and bad. And if in every kind of television series you're watching, there's good Ukrainians who recognize that they are Russians, and there's bad Ukrainians who wear vyshyvanki, the sort of the embroidered shirts, and speak Ukrainian, and they're all Nazis or collaborators or traitors, that's going to play a role after a while. The other element beyond popular culture that I would draw attention to, and this so far is all relevant to up until the war. I don't know if you want me to speak about after the war began, or after the full-scale invasion began, but the other element is that of historical framing. So this constant use of analogies, the notion in 2014, that Banderovцы, so followers of Stepan Bandera, who's a Ukrainian radical nationalist, whose supporters committed many crimes and murders against Jewish people, against Poles, and was, of course, radically anti-Soviet. the idea that these people have come back, that they are terrorizing Russians, they are terrorizing innocent people, plays, really such a huge role. I was speaking to a friend recently whose family lived under occupation in the Kherson region. And when the soldiers, one day the soldiers started knocking on everybody's house, and they were like, "Where is Stepan Bandera?" And of course, he was assassinated in
Wow.
Munich many years ago, but by an assassin who then repented. But in any case, this notion that Banderovцы are everywhere, it's really quite drilled in, and of course in itself draws on quite long-standing Soviet efforts to denigrate any form of kind of Ukrainian sovereignty, Ukrainian nationalism. Other elements include, the intervention in Syria, which was very much depicted as Russia undoing that trauma of the 1990s and returning to its rightful global place. But if you are watching news and it's constantly being conflated with a historical event, one that you basically understand, then analogies for anybody, they're incredibly, they anchor themselves very, very easily. And then it's very hard to think outside of them, because it's essentially established that these guys are like the Nazis and we are essentially the good guys defending the weak, just like we did within World War II or within the Great Patriotic War. And then to almost go against that view of what is happening in Ukraine, it's not just about going against that view of what's happening in Ukraine, it's almost about going against, a memory that is actually really quite fundamental for many Russians. It becomes about going against the memory, the use of the Great Patriotic War. And it's just a lot more complicated. It starts to become a question about identity. And of course, for many Russians, Ukraine is a question of identity. Whether or not that can be justified or otherwise is, I think, a separate discussion, but it does play that role, whether we like it to or not.
So in the context of Jade's remarks, I would urge our listeners and viewers to take a look at Amazon and Netflix. There are quite a few Russian government-produced series, one interesting one on Ivan III. And if you want to get a flavor of some of this cultural material, it's not in every case easily accessible in the US, but it is accessible and it's sort of eye-opening. I'd also like to urge our listeners and viewers, as they've already begun to do, to send in questions to the Q&A function in Zoom. We'll be very glad to sort of convey those questions to Jade in just a couple of minutes. So one additional question again about how all of this works, the kind of mechanics of it. So the word ideology has come up, and I think sometimes that suggests something that's static and, a belief system, and you can kind of lay it out in books and teach it as a kind of catechism in schools. I mean, I think that there are elements of that in Russia, but I think in some ways the better way of conceiving of this, just curious to get your opinion, is not so much as a set ideology, but more as a grammar. Use the term analogy. That appears quite often in the book. History as a set of connections, as a kind of ongoing narrative, and those who are clever enough in the kind of Russian media landscape, they can fit new things in, even if they don't quite fit. They can be fit in, and this, once you acquire the grammar, you're sort of able to speak history or able to speak politics. I just wanted to get your view of that.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I mean, I sometimes wondered if it was the fact that I'm originally a linguist by background, but it almost feels, I think I referred to it as like a crib sheet, where it's almost like the code to unlocking, to being able to explain things. I mean, the element of indoctrination and the element of codification and other elements. You do see this after 2022. You do see this after the full-scale invasion, and it is, an evolution as well. But very much, I mean, in 2012 and 2014, you see simultaneously a state effort to, I suppose, spread this language, if we refer to it as that, spread the understanding of this language. But it happens in a way which is somewhat concealed. They don't want it to look like it's state. And what's more, you also see, a lot of funding for citizen-led movements coming in, citizen-led, like historical reenactment groups. There's a real effort to make this fun, to make this, not something that is dogmatic, but actually looks quite cool. You have elements like the children's camps, Country of Heroes. You have various kind of for example, the Roads of Victory tours, which take children all around the country to different areas. You have dress ups, you have photo booths. I mean, lots of elements that essentially are just a part of what we've seen in terms of, I suppose, the increasing use of multimedia and museums and other elements, that way of making history accessible. But there's a very strong ideological element to it, in that there's a constant reference in the history, there's a constant reference to the present, and in the present there's that constant reference to the history. And it's a very clever way of controlling the frames people use to understand the world, but also the fact that the government stepped back, or at least, well, it didn't step back, but the government concealed and tried to encourage others to produce, I suppose, to incentivize people to engage with it rather than to force people, was of course clever, because it's much harder to reject something that essentially you see as your own creation. That's the issue with Immortal Regiment in many cases, is that most people continue to believe, not in Moscow or Petersburg perhaps, but certainly beyond, that this is a grassroots organization. This is something that has been created by the people and is separate from the state. And whilst it is true that it emerged in that way, since 2015, that has not been the case for Immortal Regiment, because there was a hostile takeover. So the government's very clever at that. The Russian government's very clever at that. But yes, once we get to 2022, we see a big shift, and we see then, all of these groups, for example, these patriotic hospitania, like patriotic formation groups that used to be strongly encouraged, they're now mandatory as part of the school. There's a new counselor who's put into schools to advise the head teacher to make sure that the students are engaging with these kind of historically infused patriotic formation clubs. Often they're incredibly militaristic. You also have, of course, new classes that have been introduced, and new courses that have been introduced at both the school and at the university or college level. So there's quite a marked shift, and I think that's an interesting one to consider, especially maybe for researchers like me who've been able to spend a lot of time in Russia up until the war, but what difference that might have, because we're now going to have a generation of young people who aren't growing up in what is actually, what I found to often be quite a sophisticated ideological environment in terms of the way it engaged with people in the space led. But now we're looking at something perhaps a little bit more familiar from previous generations of authoritarians, of a real indoctrination and a real militarization of the education process. And that's going to have its effect in one way or another.
I think you've provided, Jade, the perfect transition to the sort of third part of our conversation. I'm delighted to see all of the questions that are rolling in. I'm thinking back when you were speaking about these voluntary patriotic associations, or maybe voluntary patriotic associations in quotation marks, thinking back to the Night Wolves and the role that they played in the narrative of the annexation of Crimea, as if this was just a spontaneous group that sort of came out of philanthropy or charity to kind of help out the Russians of Crimea, and in the process, they sort of engendered its voluntary annexation. That argument, I think, was quite important, even if it wasn't much believed outside of Russia, but that the annexation was something that was sort of legally justified and very much the will of the people of Crimea. That argument was also made in the Donbass. I think there it became, a bit more difficult, that this was a kind of voluntary movement to join Russia. We recall, and it's in your book, of course, this notion of the Russian Spring, this sort of parodic or ironic version of the Arab Spring that was applied to Ukraine in 2014. But that had its limits, and those limits, Novorossiya was never built, and it only went so far. I don't think that the Russian government did much to really argue in 2022 that there was some sort of voluntary uprising in Ukraine that was asking the Russian soldiers to come in. I mean, the claim was kind of made. You could see a movement in that direction, but it's no longer really workable. And exactly as you were saying in your previous comment, there is a shift, and the dictatorship that Russia has becomes much more apparent on the 24th of February, 2022, and this is in some ways a typical war that a dictatorship might conduct. So, what's the media landscape within the war? How has the media acclimatized Russians to war? How has it made a case for war? How has it used history? I mean, it is, as you've already indicated, Putin's essays in the summer of 2021, which are historical in nature, the many, many references to history the wisecrack of Foreign Minister Lavrov that the two advisors or the three advisors of Putin are Ivan the Terrible, Catherine the Great, and Peter the Great, and his sort of advisors in Moscow are secondary. So that even as a kind of wisecrack points us to history and the importance of history. So how does it start to work in the early months of the war?
Mhm. I think what's interesting here is that if you look, let's say, for example, at the media, like the pro-war media, or the state-aligned media, let's say, because they're not necessarily controlled by the state, but it's in their interest to work according to the state's wishes. You see there's clearly complete shock after the initial days of the invasion, and you see everybody almost rely on this notion of Nazis because it's already there. It's a language that's already known. There's already everything in place, I suppose, to explain and to justify because it's so familiar from 2014, and it's not a narrative that ever went anywhere. This idea that Ukrainians are Nazis, I mean, it didn't appear in 2014, but it was very much developed. It was made much more elaborate and sophisticated in 2014 as a full-on, I suppose, language that was able to describe the situation. So they were able to rely on, those 8 years essentially, and of course many more, but in particular those 8 years of it's not necessarily of intense propaganda. Of course, it was intense in 2014. Then it becomes, much less noticeable, but it's always there, that constant analogizing. So that would be one element. And it doesn't necessarily always present itself as Ukrainians are Nazis. In fact, that's quite rare. It's normally a lot more sophisticated than that. It's normally about a story. Or if we think back to, for example, when the Russians towards the end of last year took, you have to forgive me, I can't remember the name. Maybe it was Makiyivka, but I could be mistaken. A place just north of Avdiivka in Ukraine, and they brought the victory banner out to fly it over, absolute ruins. There's nothing left in this place. And they were talking about how, it's just exactly the same because this is the same brigade that had raised the victory banner over Berlin, and they were doing it. And it felt so obscene. And to be honest with you, I mean, for me, watching it as somebody who studied these analogies, for 10 years, now, it felt like a really gruesome nightmare, I suppose, a visualization of my own research that it would come to this point, because just as a human being, one wishes that it would not come to that point. More broadly, in terms of the media landscape, of course, it's a much more repressive one. And I think the understanding should not be that this historical propaganda works on everybody and convinces them, but often it plays on emotions in such a way that it will at least give them a reason to not object so strongly. I think, it's in a separate book, but I talk about the idea of a spectrum of authoritarian allies, where the focus is not on making everybody, completely sign up. In fact, that's not really ideal, because then you end up with slightly uncontrollable individuals such as Yevgeny Prigozhin, who have their own ideas about how best to achieve the desired goals. But instead, rather about shifting people into more manageable or acceptable for the Kremlin position. So rather than opposition, apathy, rather than being purely apathetic, that sense of, well, everyone's against us, the world is against us, so I'm going to be with my country right or wrong idea. And then those people into, actually, I kind of support this, and that becomes, well, initially it became easier when people were involved in the war, but obviously the way that lives are being lost on the Russian side, the way that lives are being treated, the social lives being treated, increases some complications there. But in terms of the actual use of history, what's interesting is it starts to tone down a fair amount after Ukraine's successful counteroffensives in 2022. And what you see then is a reduction in the political discussion shows, because, of course, with the exception of the Russia package of channels, most Russian television channels are still reliant on advertising, and they took a big hit after 24th February. So they need to respond to what viewers want to watch, at least in some measure. And you see a shift, a reduction in the political discussion shows, and instead a shift towards, I suppose, period dramas, towards escapism, basically towards escapism television. And I think in the large cities, it's fair to say that most people are just trying to ignore the war. And be interesting to see, as the campaign gets going for the presidential elections in Russia, But we saw already in the regional in the regional elections at the end of last year that actually, after first of all going in quite gung-ho with this idea of, these are the same as our fighters at Stalingrad, these are the heroes, people were not responding to that, and it was dropped, and pretty much a lot of references to the war were dropped. So I think personally I would say that's probably quite a wise move on the Kremlin's part, because I think that the way that they have used the Great Patriotic War very much risks discrediting both the war by being in the shadow of what the Soviet Union did there, but also risks discrediting the memory itself. And I think that's going to be a big question, that if we do in the future, and I hope we do, see a very different form of Russia, such a core feature, the Great Patriotic War is going to be a very complicated tool to use to form any kind of post-Putin identity, should we ever get there, should he ever die, because it's going to be so tainted, I think, by its conflation with Russia's war on Ukraine.
So Jade, my final question, and we have a ton in the Q&A box, so and please keep sending them in. But my final question is not about Russia and Ukraine, but it's about Russia in the West. And I think that I speak here personally, I get these sort of videos occasionally on my Twitter feed, something really outrageous that's been said on one of the Russian talk shows. We're going to turn the West to nuclear ash or something like that. That will get a lot of attention, or something really kind of extreme. And the extreme stuff is interesting, and I think it matters. But I'm more interested in the kind of larger overall day-to-day argument that's made about the West. In your book, you have notions of the sort of inauthenticity of the West, the sort of inapplicability to Russia. I would imagine that narratives of the innate aggressiveness of the West are important. There's something that I think is sort of difficult to sustain for Russian media, which is, on the one hand, the West is supplying weapons to Ukraine, the collective West, and causing all kinds of problems for Russia. On the other hand, the West is this faltering, sort of incompetent, weak entity, stumbling into crisis after crisis, whether in the Middle East or elsewhere, and then riven with all kinds of internal problems. It's not patriotic as Russia is. It doesn't have the historical consciousness that Russia does. And so, if you could just lay out for our viewers and listeners the image, for the memory makers, and of course, if it's World War II, that does. Germany can very much fulfill that role of the Western other. But I'm sort of generally interested how this works. How does Russia manipulate, use, or just invent an image of the West in the midst of war to do what it wishes to do?
So I think in terms of that paradox, you pick out that the West is both really, really dangerous, but also like a bit incompetent, and failing. That's squared in the national security strategy quite neatly by the argument that the West is at its most dangerous now because it's kind of in its death throes. So, soon communism will be built, is the equivalent, I suppose, the update. Soon the West will fall. Like in your wonderful book, Michael, the West is is it the empire on which the sun is always setting? Or I can't, now I'm forgetting, but
the empire on which the sun is always setting, yeah.
That's it, yeah. It's such a beautiful phrase. And because of course you then do start to think of like Spenglerian trends and all of these other elements, all these other times when the West was, and maybe it will this time, I don't know. I can't see into the future, but it's just, it does provoke a slightly wry smile sometimes. In terms of the other contradictions, I would say that really Russian propaganda, I mean, some of the more insane, I think it's fair to call them that, insane elements that we see on, our Twitter feeds, perhaps from Solovyov or from Skabyeva's television programs, I think they are viewed as entertainment. Now, whether or not we find them entertaining is a different question, but this is entertainment. This isn't something that people would necessarily believe. Some will, you always get one, don't you? But it's more about, first of all, the fact that they are so extreme can make other extreme positions feel much less radical and more reasonable. So if you, for example, perhaps, let's say there's somebody in your family who has quite a staunch view, that actually the Russians are being too kind to the Ukrainians, they need to bomb them more, and you might have some doubts on that. But that person in your family then appears much more reasonable, because at least they're not threatening to drop a nuclear bomb and have a nuclear tsunami over. And so it's also about shaping, I suppose, moving that Overton window of what it's acceptable to say, and then it becomes much more acceptable to say, I think bluntly, genocidal things about Ukrainians, including, to like burn children, etc. But the other element about it is it's a real pick and mix, and that's what you see from the Telegram channels. And yes, the television is very popular, but Telegram is a much more popular, let's say, at least among people who are under 40. And the interesting element there, of course, is that Telegram, whilst a lot of the Telegram channels that are pro-government are clearly controlled, a lot of them, let's say, they're independent, are clearly run by, let's say, the security structures and so on. You are able, in a lot of cases, to still read opposition channels. YouTube is also not censored. And I think that's an interesting element, because so much information is censored, but then there's also this access, and it shows the extent to which the Kremlin has to contend with a certain amount of popular legitimacy. This is not just a purely, I have problems with the term totalitarian anyway, but this is not just a purely totalitarian regime. It's much easier to be a popular dictator, and it's in Putin's interests to be a popular dictator. And so what's interesting is to see the different ways that he's able or not able to achieve that, and what are the tensions, because that can then tell us a certain amount about Russian society at war as well.
Yeah, the analogy I think that's too rarely made is maybe Franco's Spain.
Yes,
and
yes.
Putin's Russia. Also, the role of the church has some parallels there, and I think in both cases I couldn't agree more. The word totalitarian is more misleading than illuminating. Well, Jade, you've provoked a ton of questions, so I will try. We're not going to go past 12:15 Washington D.C. time, so we have a good half hour for questions, and I will read them out to you. The first from Michael Keyes of the Kennan Institute, but who served in the Moscow embassy in the 90s, and then was consul general in Vladivostok from 2016 to 2019, and feels that your comments ring true. Do you think that where we are in terms of Western relations with Russia today was inevitable, or is it possible that we have helped to create Putin's Russia today because of the perception that the West stopped respecting Russia after Mr. Putin came to power in year 2000? I'm thinking in particular about the constant references to Russia as a regional power in the 2000s.
Understood. Thank you. I think obviously, of course, you can't say that the West had no impact on, the way that Russia emerged, and you can't say that the West, you certainly can't say the West did everything correctly, or not with a straight face. But I think at a certain point, I don't like and this is not the argument that the questioner is making at all, but you do hear it sometimes. Russia has agency for its decisions, and it can choose how to react. And ultimately, if we go back to the sort of the NATO expansion enlargement debate, perhaps at some point Russia might have thought, why are all of our neighbors so terrified of us that they want to join an alliance that we would rather they didn't join? What can we do to perhaps make ourselves a more attractive partner for some of these neighboring countries? In terms of the 90s, though, I think a lot of mistakes were made, and perhaps this is spending too much time in Russia, I don't know, but for me, the thing that really sticks in my mind, and that really comes up so often as well in Russian discourse, is that of the bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, or Rump Yugoslavia in 1999. And I find it very funny because it's very rarely brought up in Western discussions, but it plays this really important role in terms of, I suppose, Russia's understanding of the post-Soviet space. It's the ultimate sign of Western disrespect for Russia. But also it's that moment when Russia begins to turn around, and quite literally, because there's the constant references to Yevgeny Primakov's U-turn over the Atlantic. And it plays this almost symbolic role of that is Russia also making that U-turn just as a broader, that's when Russia starts to fight back. So I think there's definitely things to sort of reflect on, but I mean, in terms of, let's say, some of the humiliations of status, et cetera, a lot, of course, is also made in terms of the economic factors. And one of the elements I find very fascinating there is, during the sanctions that were imposed in 2014, there were all of these really quite nasty references to Bush's legs, which is the chicken legs that America sent sent to Russia, and this notion of that was absolute, nadir of the post-Soviet age. It's awful that they had these. We had to live off these Bush's legs, and they were disgusting because they were American. So obviously they were disgusting. All of these quite emotive and slightly churlish comments on them. And I was talking about it recently with a Ukrainian friend, and they said, well, we didn't get any Bush's legs. We didn't get any help during the 90s. And of course, they also had a terrible crisis. So, and it just, for me, it summed up this notion that, yes, there's this resentment. Yes, there's this, anger, this, I suppose, slight inferiority / superiority complex with the West. But these are not things that were created by the 1990s. And the way that Russia has reacted is not the way it had to react. I don't think that there's anything inevitable about how we got here. I think, for example, if there had been a different type of response in 2014, then we probably would not be where we are today. Well, where we are, we're all fine. Ukraine wouldn't be where it is today.
Next question is from Jill Doherty. Although did that just disappear from? Oh no, here it is. Jill Doherty, who has important connections to the Kennan Institute, who asks Jade if you could explain, after thanking you for the conversation, if you could explain in a bit more detail how the Kremlin inculcates historical memory with young people born after the USSR ended and have known no leader other than Putin. What are the complexities of doing this?
Mm-hmm. I think there, of course, you're relying on basically the education system. And it's very hard now to sort of unthink what's happened since 2022. Until then, there was a promotion of, for example, summer camps where you could go and you would learn about history, a lot of after school clubs. There are, of course, special kind of Cossack schools and other quite specially sort of historically informed schools that you, in many cases, actually, for example, there's a particular area of Tatarstan, there are only these certain types of schools that are brought up by them, that bring children up in a more imperial, militaristic tradition. That would be one element. Of course, also popular culture itself. Many of these same students would be consuming that same popular culture, but there's a real limit to what they can do even now, because even now, when you have, school textbooks becoming unified, though that's not a process that's finished by any means, when you have the introduction of these different classes, people still have access to YouTube. Lots of young people watch, all sorts of interesting historical documentaries. There are so many, interesting YouTubers or even TikTokers who, make short or longer videos. If we think back to Yuri Dude's YouTube video about Kolyma and, the role of the Gulag and what happened there. So there are ways that it can try to, and it's becoming increasingly stringent on that. But there's always going to be, as long as there's access to YouTube, and bluntly, there will always be some access to YouTube, especially among technically savvy people, there's always going to be a limit to how much they can entirely impose that. That said, there is, a genuine anti-Westernism, a genuine sense of, if you look at sort of polls, up to the war, you see, yes, young people are more liberal on many social elements, but the idea that Russia is a great power, that it's separate from the West, that's still very prominent, just as prominent as among older generations. So there's something still for them to appeal to, I suppose, that sense of Russian superiority. And I guess it can tap into that. And also that notion that this is, even they are, the heirs to the heroes of the Great Patriotic War. Who doesn't want to be the heir to a hero, who achieved these victories? I want to be an heir to a hero. So there's other ways, just basic kind of human ways that it can appeal as well.
So next question is from Marjorie Balzer, and it's about how the non-Russians in Russia fit into the usable memory propaganda beyond tropes of peaceful incorporation of peoples into the Russian Empire.
No, it's a great question. It's not one I could talk about, of course, for all the nations. I don't have anywhere near the level of expertise for that. The particular region I focused on is Kalmykia, because, of course, their memory of the Great Patriotic War is not very interchangeable with the ethnic Russian or the centralized Russian narrative, because well, the whole nation was deported, and Kalmykia itself as an entity within the USSR was destroyed. And that's very interesting because essentially it doesn't fit. They just ignore the centralized narratives, like the local branches of the Russian Historical Society, Russian Military History Society. They just ignore the Kalmyk experience. And there's even a tour that they produced that's of all the sites of the Great Patriotic War. And it's fascinating because they go into a museum, where there are exhibitions on the deportations, but they don't visit that exhibition. They walk past the train wagon, it's not a wagon, train carriage, there we are, that stands, in the middle of a Elista, and it's not referenced within the tour, even though this is a tour of like military history sites of World War II. So they essentially just do not engage with it. They just try to explain to Kalmykians that they are also heirs of the heroes, and they don't engage with the actual history. And of course, like always with memory, it's not really about history anyway.
Next question echoes a little bit the previous one from Sarah Grunenbach, who asks if you could speak to the intersections of Russian Orthodox Church, military, and Kremlin narratives of history that specifically pressurize titular Caucasus nationalities within geographic Russia, Dagestanis, Chechens, Ingush, Circassians. Rather specific question.
I'm probably not best placed to answer that question, to be honest. I mean, in terms of a lot more deference is made to the Chechen experience because of Chechnya's political prickliness, if we put it euphemistically, for the Russian Federation and recent history. And we saw that actually when Krasov was sent, when the Russian education minister was sent to apologize for the unfortunate wording about the deportations of nations in the recent unified state historical textbook. In terms of the role of the Russian Orthodox Church, I think here, the roles of Tikhon, the role of Tikhon in particular in creating like the Russia My History exhibitions, which are often, opened in, one of which has recently been opened in Melitopol, occupied Melitopol, which shows the importance of imposing a historical narrative on the newly occupied territories of Ukraine that are currently under Russian occupation. But I would also, if people are specifically interested in the role of the church and the spreading of these narratives, certainly from the perspective of Ukraine, I'm very sorry, I can't speak more to the Caucasus. The Frolov leaks are very interesting there. So if you Frolov, I can put it in the chat, because they expose the mechanisms by which the church is involved in the pushing of these historical grievance, resentment, and how it identifies and then kind of artificially inflates them in other countries or in other regions.
Jade, this is a question from James Wirch, which is going to speak to your inner linguist, and returns to the notion of grammar. So do the local grammars and codes, both in quotation marks, do these things that you mention take the form of narratives or narrative templates? And I think this is a really important question for the Kennan Institute with its emphasis on research and studying Russia and surrounding countries. How can we study this? How can we study the relationship between a kind of grammar of patriotism, a grammar of historical memory, and the big sort of sweeping narratives that that can be sort of pulled from it?
I would say that initially they were narratives, but they became a narrative template over time because of the extent to which they were implicated. So I'd say at this point we're talking about a narrative template, but originally we're talking about narratives that, even though they almost came from a template. Let's say Ukrainians are collaborators and traitors, within Ukrainians who want Ukrainian sovereignty are nationalists, are collaborators and traitors to Russia. Then they were developed almost out in order to bring it up to the present, to make it as emotive as possible, and then were so intensely used that by this point they are once again narrative templates. So if you say Ukrainians are banderovцы, it raises the whole I suppose plethora of other elements. In terms of how can we research it, I agree, it's a really important question. For me, the issue was one of immersion. So I originally tried to use sort of like computer assisted sort of programs to analyze it, and it just wasn't giving me what I knew was there because I had, literally watched these shows. So I just had to go through it manually, and I went through, well over 10,000 different examples. And I think you do have to have that immersion. Of course, the other side to that immersion is you can't just immerse yourself in the information space. You really need to be immersed among the people who are, I mean, reception is always very difficult to, it's the constant conundrum within communication studies, how to measure like how effective or how people receive a message. But at the same point, there is just something perhaps intangible about being, you know, in the country, about traveling around the country, seeing the differences, seeing the nuances. And that's a huge research obstacle now, because, you know, for many people it won't be safe, for many people it may not be desirable, etc., etc.
And if we infer from Soviet history, which is an imperfect source, there is a shelf life to all of this. These grammars, vocabularies, narratives, ideologies, if you will, they don't last forever. They exhaust themselves. And that I think you can only sense when you're inside the country, how sort of sick and tired people get of it or how much they see through it. That is truly difficult to perceive from the outside, but very, very important for researchers of all kinds and policymakers to reckon with, because I would argue Russian public opinion is probably the key variable in the whole war. If it stays behind the war, that's going to take us down one path. If it breaks with the war, it will take us down another. So I think that your research, Jade, is at the very center of this ongoing story. So two questions from Michael Waller. First, is there a difference between the Russian narrative for domestic consumption versus that for consumption elsewhere? And secondly, how much of the Russian narrative is directed and controlled from the top down versus perhaps outsourced to friendly third parties who have some latitude to shape that narrative for particular audiences? Two great questions.
They're great questions. So the domestic and the international one, I mean, they're pretty similar in terms of the broad structure of them, but I would differentiate between, I call it sort of memory export. So where Russia is just trying to export its own narrative pretty much as it is at home. Or it's trying to export even, you know, certain practices like the Immortal Regiment, which of course takes place not only in Russia, but in many, many countries. And interestingly, last year, 2023, it took place, I think in around 28, but don't quote me on that. It took place in dozens, let's say, or a number of countries abroad, but of course didn't take place in Moscow. So that was like an interesting element, I suppose. And there is this kind of globalization of it. So where it's kind of it's made, some adaptations are made to make it better fit, but very broadly, we're talking about Russia just exporting a cultural or a memory product or narrative that it's own. But you also have elements of memory alliances, and that's more where Russia will try to tap into a narrative that exists and is organically there as part of the cultural memory of, let's call it, the target nation, and to insert itself into that narrative. And I would say the obvious example here would be, well, there are many examples, you know, the fight against colonialism in Africa is an obvious one that plays a role in Russian domestic memory, but certainly not a large one. It's almost an add-on, oh, and we did this because we're the good guys, whereas it's pretty central to not just Russian narratives, but actually to the entire way that they organize much of their cultural diplomacy in Africa. Secondly, I think always of, and it's harder because it's an American audience, for the British audience, probably people would start laughing/crying, but we had, during the coronavirus pandemic, we had a 100-year-old man who was a veteran of World War II who walked around a building many, many times to raise money for the NHS. He became a sort of big star. His family very much sort of marketed him. That's a slightly different story for somebody who deals with the historical memory of Britain. What was interesting is Russia immediately responded, and it found a veteran of Stalingrad, a lady who then knitted Captain Tom, the name of the British veteran, some socks, you know, and they really tried to engage with it, and RT really tried to engage with Captain Tom. So in general, I suppose the same way that they do with most of their information campaigns, they wait to see what's organic, and then they try to insert themselves into it or to inflate it if it's useful to them, or to slightly divert it. And then in terms of top down, there's a lot of it now that is top down. Putin is himself somewhat of a historical obsessive, as Michael has referred to, via Lavrov. But a lot of this is outsourced. And what's interesting is when we start to look at some of the content, I mean, there was a wonderful study of this in Важные истории, but it was about pro-war propaganda, but the same is true for history, is for some of the historical content, is the people who are making this, sometimes they can be completely, you know, they do not agree with the narratives, they can be quite anti-war, etc., etc. But just the way that it is done, I suppose that outsourcing, that networking, means that some of the content is good, and you know, some of the content is ideologically dubious, morally dubious, but it's not bad. You know, you can watch it; it's decent.
So there's a follow-on question, which may be a little bit far afield from your actual research, but it's an interesting question from Michael Masters about whether you've compared films from the US and the UK about the Second World War with those that Russia has produced. Sort of makes me think a little bit of the film Dunkirk and its many messages, which I sort of interpreted as a film a bit about Brexit, but you know, there are tons of films, of course, in the Anglo-American space about the Second World War. Is that of interest to you to sort of relate them to Russia, or is that something that an ambitious graduate student should pursue?
I mean, it's not something that I've, I suppose, researched in an entirely academic sense, but I'm British. I watch British World War II films, so it's impossible not to apply that. And in particular, the Winston Churchill film. You have to give me, there's a lot of Winston Churchill films, and I cannot remember the name.
Perhaps, or...
Yes, Darkest Hour, thank you. When he goes onto the tube, he goes onto the underground, the subway, and he talks with ordinary people, and they give him the strength to know that he needs to carry on the fight. And it's just absolute total nonsense, because the idea of Winston Churchill essentially being on a tube is just completely obscene, you know, to anybody who knows the historical reality of who Winston Churchill was. But what I found interesting was the director's justification of including that scene, which did not happen. And it said, because, you know, it spoke to a larger truth of who Churchill was and how he was in tune with the public. And it immediately reminded me of the whole sort of furore around the Panfilov's 28 Guardsmen in Russia, where basically everybody knows that this myth is a myth, that it's not true. But the argument that the culture minister who funded the film made was that sometimes myths are more true, sometimes they speak to a sort of broader truth. So I think that brings us quite neatly back, I suppose, to the start of the conversation, which is, you know, this is not something that just Russia is doing. This is something, history is a way for anybody on a basic human level. You can't make sense of the future without using your past experience. It's not possible. You can't imagine, you know, you can't know what you don't know. But also it's just a huge part of a nation's identity, of going back to the past. So what's interesting is not, I suppose, the fact that Russia uses the past, it's the intensity, and it's to what end.
Question now from Jan Kalitsky. Please excuse me if I've mispronounced your name, but it's about the impact of Russian journalists now in exile, what you could characterize, I suppose, as independent journalism in Lithuania, Georgia, elsewhere. What influence does this have, or what impact does this have on countering the current media dictatorship? In Jan Kalitsky's words, what more can be done, i.e. support of exiled journalists, Radio Free Europe, BBC, etc., to counter this media dictatorship? So this is both a kind of academic question, but it's also a policy question.
Mm-hmm. I mean, in terms of readership numbers, of course, it depends slightly on what outlet you're looking at. Also, an outlet like Medusa has incredible reach despite the many efforts to shut it down. And I think it's important, almost regardless of their reach, though I do not want to dismiss it. I think it's important to keep different visions of Russia alive. So sometimes the issue with, I know something you and I have discussed previously, Michael, sometimes the issue with like questions about how to support Russians abroad or how to do this, it's framed in quite sort of almost mercantile terms of like, what can they do for us? You know, it has that element of, and then if we support them, then they'll overthrow Putin. And then that creates as well sort of a stricture for them, because all of their approach to getting funding or getting support for those Russians in exile has to come back to, if we can do this, then we'll overthrow Putin. And I think realistically, that's not something that is on the cards right now. And I think that supporting different visions of Russia, supporting Russian journalism, supporting, Russian independent journalism is a good in and of itself. It's a value in and of itself that should be treasured, regardless of whether or not they are managing to truly appeal to, I don't know, let's say like the former steel worker who hasn't worked for like since the steel factory closed in the 1990s in Penza. Like, I have no idea if they make steel in Penza, apologies to steel specialists, but the notion, I think it's important to keep them alive. And I suppose the only other comment I would make is that I do think that more thought, however, needs to be made to how to speak, how to create a vision of Russia that is appealing not only to those people who already quite like the West, but also to those who don't like the West. But that's a question for Russians in exile, I think. Not that's something that needs to come from inside, from among Russians. That's not really something for, in my view, that Western policymakers can sort out.
So two final questions, and the first I'm going to just amalgamate a few from our audience that are about the Russian Orthodox Church, and I'll ask it in the simplest form possible. I think that they're curious to know how you can study it. What sources might you use, or how might you go about studying its role in the media landscape, its connections to the Kremlin, its connections to the war in Ukraine? What advice might you have to scholars and researchers for approaching the subject?
I think I would first of all start with, I suppose, like a case study approach. And I think that if you look at the Russian Orthodox Church's efforts in Ukraine before 2014, that's a fascinating place to start. And again, I would go back to the Frolov leaks, because you just have years and years and years of this person who works in Rostov-Trudnichestvo, but is essentially the go-to between the Russian Orthodox Church and Ukrainian politics. You see that Yanukovych's personal confessor is basically deciding who's in the cabinet. I mean, it's really, really fascinating. And you get an idea of how this works. Other elements I would suggest are to look at the Russian Orthodox Church's own different, I mean, it has a website. There's a lot of information. It produces a lot of news. It's an incredible resource for understanding about their activities, for example, in Syria with the Christian minority in Syria and the rebuilding of churches. But in terms of the narratives, of course, elements such as Ruski Mir, and now the new Russian movement or international movement, of Russophiles, which has an interesting French link as well, which when we think about the sort of the cultural center that was opened in Paris, also raises certain questions and these notions, I suppose, of Christianity. So there's lots of places to start. I think that the best place to start, though, would be to start with those sources that the Russian Orthodox Church itself provides, or perhaps has not provided, that the Ukrainian activists have taken from them.
The quote from George Orwell that I'm going to mangle, but that's sometimes the most difficult thing is to see what's in front of your nose. And one of the things I take away from Jade's research and from her conversation today is that we need to study the many things that are there. There's sort of a lot there, whether it's Telegram, whether it's sort of television, websites, etc. We have a lot of sources of insight into all of this. Part of the challenge is to put them to use. So here's our final question from Lyubov Zhiznomirska from Department of Political Science, St. Mary's University in Canada, who thanks you for an interesting conversation. Could you comment on the gendered nation of historical memory making in Russia? So this is our final question, takes us to a whole new set of concerns, and I think it's a very interesting, stimulating place to wrap up our conversation today.
No, it is, and it's an incredibly pertinent one, because, of course, it is insanely gendered. It's an incredibly militaristic approach to history. The glorification of war and of certain traditionally masculine traits does not leave much space for women, except in a sort of supportive, caring role. We've all seen recently, the efforts being made, and again, it's interesting to think of the church's role here in terms of rolling back abortion rights within Russia. Russia, of course, has one of the highest abortion rates in the world, and given certain demographic concerns that aren't being lessened by the fact they're sending so many men to die or being maimed in Ukraine, are going to get worse. So it all sort of, I suppose, ties in with the political scene as well, but the later impact that this militarization of what it means to be a man within Russia, I think, is going to cause lots of problems, particularly because many of the ideals that are promoted as masculine ideals, in particular the notion that, okay, men have to be able to provide for their family, they have to do X, Y, Z, they're actually really quite unrealistic within a Russian context. And so quite, you know, for a lot of men, there is this sense of failure because they're unable to let's say, you know, be the sole earner, etc., which is what culture is telling them they have to be in order to be a real man. And you see the propaganda adverts for the war very much playing on that sense of failed manhood, of, okay, you can't afford a phone for your daughter, or, you know, you have this job that isn't really very important, isn't very manly, but if you go to the war, then you're somebody, or then you're going to get a lot of money, then you're going to fulfill these functions of manliness. So it's a bit of a vicious cycle where you create conditions that no man is really able, or very few men are able to live up to. They then feel like they're failures. So then you create, I suppose, the outlet for that failed masculinity, or perceived failed masculinity. And it just so happens to be that same war and militarism that has been so inculcated and will be increasingly inculcated in future generations.
So the title of the book that we've been talking about today is Memory Makers. I wish I had a physical copy to hold up here to advertise, but you know, I think the whole conversation has been sufficient advertisement for the book. We're so delighted, Jade, that you could join us today for a Kennan Institute Longview conversation. Let me thank again Victoria Pardini and the staff of the Kennan Institute for all that they did to make this possible. Please keep on the lookout for future Longview conversations. We'll publicize them as we do. And I want to thank our audience as well for the excellent questions. But most of all, Jade, I'd like to thank you for joining us, for taking the time and for sharing all of your very rich insight into questions that I think go to the core of where Russia is at the moment, and also by extension, sort of what Western policy should be. So thank you so much, Jade.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kennan Institute. Thank you, Michael. Thank you to everybody who asked questions and listened.